The best way to sell yourself in job interviews in 2026 is using your best stories. 95% of candidates cannot build a story bank that's good enough by their own standards. Okay, and there's two ways to explain this. First is no one cares that you prepared 50 stories for your job interview because you're only going to be able to sell yourself on 2 or 3 of them in each round. Okay, so having too many stories isn't necessarily to your advantage. The other extreme is you could, in theory, have only one great story which you'd spin with each and every interviewer. Right? The problem with that is that they will ask you multiple questions in each interview, and they might also confront their notes in a bit to find out on whether you have sufficient experience for the job. Right? So where I found the best outcomes with the story banks would be to have somewhere between 15 to 20 stories which you would revise at least 3 times. Maybe a closing remark here. You can have the best story in the world, but unless it's intelligible, you will not be able to get a favorable outcome. So what I would suggest you here would be to ideally role play your stories before your job interview, just to ensure that they will come across as you expect them to. The second thing I like to talk about here when it comes to selling yourself in job interviews in 2026 would be merit-based interviews. Okay, so prove them that you can do the job. For example, I sometimes coach candidates who can interview exceptionally well. Okay, and one such instance with a senior technical PM, we did a few sessions, they went extremely well, but still the client wanted to book more coaching sessions with me. And then I asked, hey, but you interview extremely well behaviorally, so why would you want to insist on this? To which they answered, hey, you know what, then I cannot, I'm very bad at system design. So that's why I would like to improve at least on the behavioral side. So basically, system design is a core aptitude to do for any technical PM. So the best approach in 2026 in merit-based interviewing as a trend would be to find the right balance between technical and behavioral, and you should ensure that you have sufficient experience on the subject matter expertise. And of course, you can then complement that with your behavioral interviewing skills. Okay. The third thing I find essential to sell yourself well in job interviews in 2026 would be your listening skills and your ability to read the room. Okay, and if I may just share a quick example with you, I once asked a software engineer, how do you deal with people who don't like you? To which they answered, then whenever someone does not like me, I have a psychological framework to gain their trust. Okay. Now, if you read a little bit between the lines of the question, of handling conflict for a job description of a software engineer, you'll understand that the expectations for a software engineer would be to be able to diffuse functional conflicts using their subject matter expertise and maybe a little bit of interpersonal skills. So what the software engineer should have said would be a functional conflict, right? Something, I don't know, maybe some coding, to which they found some data to prove their point and essentially to regain the other person's trust. That is when compared to a psychological framework would make no sense for the job description. Expectations, right? And the last thing I want to talk about that I found extremely important when it comes to job interviews in 2026 would be to move on with the times. So there's a major shift happening from a candidate-driven to an employer-driven market. In an employer-driven market, you can expect the employer to have the upper hand most of the time, and you can expect more stressful situations. What happens in stressful situations is that most candidates would either block or become extremely negative, which is something, unless you trained for prior to the job interview, you might come across as overly negative and stressed out. So what I would encourage you would be, of course, ideally have a more positive attitude, but to prepare for especially these types of more stressful events, because that's what I found. It pays off to deal with these ambiguous situations, especially during an employer-driven market. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.